The ability to bounce back is admirable, but it isn't unusual. People who suffer a wide range of traumas and tragedies tend to recover more quickly than they themselves would have predicted. Yes, they're sad, they're miserable, they're even devastated for a while. But studies show that most people end up being as happy or nearly as happy as they were before. Resilience isn't rare. In fact, it's very common.
There is some set point to happiness that you tend to return toward. And for some people, it's very happy, and for other people, it's mildly happy. And unfortunately, for a few people, it may not be happy. But the set point is good in the sense that when we have something terrible in our life happen to us, we get very depressed, we get less satisfied with our life. But slowly over time, we come back toward that set point.
This process is critical to human happiness. But how do we do it? And why do some of us do it so much more easily than others? For more than 15 years, Dr. Dennis Charney has been studying people who've shown exceptional resilience after trauma. From survivors of natural disasters, to prisoners of war, to the firemen who responded when the World Trade Center was attacked on September 11th.
It was fascinating to deal with resilient individuals because when you met them, you looked at them and thought, well, how did you do this? You know, you start thinking, could I have done that? How did they do it?
One of Charney's most interesting subjects was Bob Shoemaker, a former Navy pilot.
I grew up on a farm in western Pennsylvania, and my parents were middle class, so I consider myself fairly average. But average people get thrown into extraordinary situations.
Bob's ordeal began in 1965 when he was assigned to combat duty in Vietnam. He'd just been married and had a son. Then suddenly, life as he knew it came to an end.
The mission I was on was just north of the demilitarized zone that separated North Vietnam from South Vietnam. We were really low, and I pulled out right over a flak site, and they managed to hit me in the tail section, and the plane flipped upside down, and I ejected, and the parachute fortunately opened, but opened only 35 feet above the ground, and so I broke my back as I landed. That was it, you know, they got me, they bound me, had handcuffs on me behind my back and marched me off.
For 8 years, Shoemaker was shuttled between North Vietnamese prisons, including the infamous Hanoi Hilton, where he was brutally tortured.
The really worst technique was what we call the rope treatment, where they would tie a rope from your handcuffs up over your shoulders and down to your feet, and they would tighten this thing up so that eventually your head would reach your feet. And you think it can't happen, you know, particularly when your knees are straight, but it was excruciating. And then they jammed an iron bar down my throat to keep me from screaming. So that was the technique that would get you to condemn your own grandmother if you had to.
The torture Shoemaker endured was not just physical. For almost 3 years, he was held in solitary confinement.
There were 11 of us in cells and no windows and a solitary light bulb hanging down that burned 24 hours a day.
To deal with his isolation, Shoemaker imagined the house that he would build for his young family if he ever returned.
I'm almost embarrassed to admit to you that there would be days when I would spend maybe 10 or 12 hours just thinking about how many bricks were in this house. I knew that there were, say, 5,227 nails in the thing and so many board feet of lumber. I'd spend a year and a half designing the perfect house, and then one day I'd say, well, what would happen if I moved the fireplace from this room to that room? It'd send me back to square one, and I'd redesign the thing.
Although Shoemaker was physically isolated from the other prisoners, together they created an ingenious form of communication.
We developed the tap code in which the alphabet was arranged in a square that had 5 rows and 5 columns. You'd say, that's the second row, second column, this is G. That's first row, second column B, and U is fourth row, fifth column is the U, so GBU is God bless you. So the tap code really kept our spirits alive, our hopes alive, our dreams. And so we transmitted things like French lessons through the wall and music lessons and how to fix a television set and biology lessons. So we spent a lot of time on the wall.
These conversations were crucial to Shoemaker's survival, and they became a focus of Dennis Charney's research.
Social support is a key factor in becoming a resilient individual. You can't do it alone. You need other people. I think the TAP code experience of the POWs is among the most important lessons. And we use the phrase that everybody needs a TAP code. Everybody needs a way of communicating with other people to establish friendships that are supportive, to establish relationships that provide you a guidepost as you get through tough times.
Charney also discovered that highly resilient people tended to share some other qualities as well. They tended to have strong religious or moral beliefs, strong role models, and a strong streak of optimism.
It was not an unrealistic optimism. They were able to accurately apprise themselves of what they were facing. So it wasn't denial. They knew that they had been traumatized or they were facing a very difficult situation. But they had an ability to be optimistic that somehow that they would prevail.
You know, I only received 7 letters in 8 years, and the letters were occasionally pessimistic, like telling me my mother had suddenly died and things like that. And you just have to be able to, you know, just suck it up and reach down somewhere in your soul and come out with the wherewithal to overcome the present circumstances and be upbeat and get on with it.
After 8 years of captivity, Bob Shoemaker was finally released, his spirit unbroken by the horrors he endured. The first thing he did was call his wife.
I wondered who this man was. I didn't know him very much. We had a very short courtship. Our baby was born just 5 weeks before Bob was shot down and captured. I remember this phone call saying, "Hi, honey," and that literally erased 8 years of time. It's hard to explain that, but that was the person I knew. And that was the person that returned home.
Shoemaker had done more than just survive. In his view, he had grown.
Well, I suppose one way of looking at 8 years of imprisonment is to say, hey, that's just wasted time. You know, have to put that behind me. It's unfortunate. But paradoxically, you know, I gained something out of this 8 years of experience.
In the years after his release, Shoemaker became a rear admiral, a college professor, a devoted husband and father. And he turned the house that he'd so often imagined into a reality.
It was something in my soul I just had to get out, you know, and see the fulfillment. I wanted a house that had a lot of openness to it, and I think that was probably as a result of my being confined without windows or anything. So the house I designed has a lot of glass. I was deprived of freedom for such a long time. I think I really cherish freedom more than most people do now.
Bob, like almost all the other POWs that we interviewed and got to know very well, said that to the following question: if you could have eliminated the POW experience from your life, would you do so? In other words, you could have just wiped that out. It never happened. And Bob, like many of the others, said no, because I learned things about myself during that experience. And I learned tools, psychological tools in which to handle my life that I probably could never learn in any other way. And so it stood me in good stead for the rest of my life.
Being a prisoner really focuses on what's essential in life. And there are a lot of things that we can do without and still be happy.
The key lessons from Bob Shoemaker's story are that inside almost all of us is the capacity to overcome the most horrific of stresses in our life and even ultimately learn from that stress and thrive and grow as a person.
You learn resilience by falling down and getting back up again. And as you fall down and get back up again, you say, oh my God, I'm back up again. The setback or the failure that I thought I would never recover from, in fact, I've recovered from perfectly well, which means that I can do that again.
My resilience has been slowly learning to trust that whatever path I take can be positive. Even the worst decisions I've made have had, positive ramifications if I choose to learn from them.
Well, I want to make sure that people know that I'm happy that I had a messed up childhood, that I'm glad I was damaged, because it made me a better actor, it made me a better writer, it made me a better creator. So I thank my family for that. I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. Then I would have, but not now.
Human beings have a talent for adapting, a talent for finding happiness where we'd least expect it. But if we can adapt to a lifetime in a wheelchair or a decade in prison, then why can't we adapt to the ordinary misfortunes of everyday life? The answer is that adaptation is something the mind does when there's nothing else it can do. We adapt to misfortunes when we know we can't change them. But when we stand a fighting chance, we fight. And that's why we struggle so much with temporary misfortunes.